I'm Phyllis Rappaport, chair of the Rappaport Foundation in Boston. Thank you for joining our terrific panel discussion. Does prison reform or does prison need reforming? For those of you unfamiliar with our work, the Rappaport Foundation supports emerging leadership in the fields of public policy, medical research, and contemporary art. I encourage you to visit our website, rappaportfoundation.org, to read about how our alumni are making an impact on state and local government, neurologic disease and mental illness, and transforming minds through art. Today, I have the real pleasure of introducing our moderator, Jeffery Robinson. Since March 2021, Jeffery is founder and CEO of the Who We Are Project, a nonprofit organization working to expose and promote the historical truths of anti-Black racism in the United States. One of his lectures, Who We Are, a Chronicle of Racism in America, forms the basis of the feature-length documentary of the same name, which you can view streaming on TV. Jeffery embraced this work after becoming a nationally recognized trial attorney and expert in trial advocacy. He graduated from Harvard Law School in 1981 and worked for 4 decades on criminal and racial justice as public defender, private practitioner, and then as deputy legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union and director of the ACLU's Trone Center for Justice and Equality. Jeffery is a faculty member of the National Criminal Defense College. He's a past president of the Washington Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and winner of that association's prestigious William O. Douglas Award. He's a lifetime member of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers. Last but not least, Jeffery is currently the Jerome Law Rappaport Distinguished Visiting Professor at Boston College Law School. And now I hand it over to you, Jeffery, to introduce our panelists and lead our discussion.
Thank you very much. I am so thrilled to have the honor of being part of this discussion, and the experience as a Rappaport Visiting Fellow has been enriching beyond my expectations. And I have an incredible panel that I have the honor to moderate, and I'm going to introduce them in just a second. But before I do that, I wanted to give sort of a 10,000-foot view of why we are here and what it is that we're actually, dealing with as we try and answer this question about prisons, prison reform, and does prison need reforming? So if we just think about the last 51 years, 1971 to 2022, it kind of looks like this. 1971 is when Richard Nixon launched the war on drugs. And as you can see, the prison population in America, this is jails and prisons, all incarcerated people, was around 200,000. And it started going up right after the war on drugs. And you can see what's happening there. It was up at around 300,000. So between 300,000 and 400,000. And this is what happened. And it wasn't an accident. In just 40 years, the prison population increased 800%. So we have to ask ourselves, what was going on with that? And when we think about the prison population of America, understand that 1 out of 5 incarcerated people in the world is incarcerated right here in the United States. And that's despite us having about 5% of the world's population. 11 million people around the world are in prison and jails, and the US locks up a larger share of these people than any other country. And it's equal to or slightly greater than the 194 smallest countries with the smallest incarcerated populations, that is. It actually looks something like this. And when you see it visually, you understand the disparity of the US prison system. Mass incarceration impacts millions of people. But one of the things that I think our panelists will be dealing with is how many people and in what ways. So if there are 1.9 million people incarcerated in prison today, in prison or jail, there are actually 4.9 million that were formerly incarcerated in state or federal prison. 19 million who have ever been convicted of a felony, 79 million who have some kind of criminal record, and 113 million adults who have an immediate family member who's ever been to prison or jail. And for most people who are formerly incarcerated, there are collateral consequences that follow that jail time, that thing of, I've done my time, I've paid my debt to society, and now I'm here to move forward. That has been a myth. And this visual will just give you an idea. The federal collateral consequences are the same in every state. That gives you a graphic idea of how many federal collateral consequences there are for people convicted of crimes. This is what happens when you add on the state collateral consequences. And this is the state of Massachusetts, where I'm teaching at Boston College Law School. And finally, the women's prison population has been growing much faster than the men's prison population. Don't get me wrong, and we'll talk about this, but there are many more men in prison than there are women. But you go back to 1978 and you can see which population is growing at a much, much higher rate. And finally, when it comes to racial and ethnic disparities in these correctional facilities, I don't think this will surprise anyone. If you see on the left-hand side of the chart what percentage you are of the US population, and on the right-hand side of the chart what percentage you are of the incarcerated population, you see that white Americans made up in this time period 60% of the population and 38% of the incarcerated population, whereas Black Americans made up 13% of the population and 38% of the incarcerated population. If this is what we're looking at, then we need help in digging into these issues. And we've got 3 people on this panel who can help us do that. Evie Litwok is a founder and executive director of Witness to Mass Incarceration. She is the child of Holocaust survivors and an avid activist for ending mass incarceration. She's using her experience as a formerly incarcerated woman to bring to light the atrocities and collateral consequences of imprisonment through her research work and her speaking engagements. Her programs put the voices of women and LGBTQ+ people and their experiences in the fight for alternatives to mass incarceration, with initiatives designed to change the narrative about incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, from invisibility and victimization to empowerment through documentation, leadership training, organizing, and advocacy. Evie, thank you so much for joining us. Chris Wilson was born and raised right outside of Washington, D.C. He is a formerly incarcerated author, artist, and advocate, and an entrepreneur. At 17 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison. And on top of that, they suggested, why don't you spend 117 days in solitary confinement? And during that time, somehow, he was able to commit himself to bettering himself and taking classes to get his GED to forward his education. Following what he called his master plan, Chris continued to pursue education, receiving an associate's degree in sociology. He got back into the general population and became a mentor to other incarcerated people, spearheading initiatives to start a career center and a book club at his facility. And after presenting the work he'd done alongside a copy of his master plan, his sentence was commuted by a judge, and he was released after serving 16 years. Our benefit, let me be clear. Upon his release, he began using his art and entrepreneurship to help others and survivors of solitary who are re-entering society. His book, Master Plan, My Journal from Life in Prison to a Life of Purpose, was published in 2019. And let me suggest to you that last, but certainly not least, on our panel is Kevin Ring. Kevin is the president of criminal justice reform advocacy group, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. Prior to joining FAMM in 2008, Kevin was a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He was twice named one of K Street's top rainmakers by the Hill. He was indicted in September of 2008 on public corruption charges as part of the Jack Abramoff lobbyist scandal. And after 2 trials and appeals, he served 20 months in federal prison. He is now president of FAMM and has testified before Congress and state legislators across the country regarding sentencing reform and prison reform. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. And I would just like to start this by throwing out kind of a big, not so big, but a question to the panel. Does prison reform people, or does prison need reforming? If there was a big area that you would say, this is the first place where I would look to as I answer that question, I'm wondering if each of you could maybe take a few minutes to talk about that. And Evie, could I start with you and just toss it to you? What is the big place for you where this conversation starts?
I think we begin by stopping the warehousing of people with drug addictive problems, with mental health problems. We look at in the prison I was at, a lot of the women had gambling related issues and were there because they stole money to buy scratch off cards. So one area we need to walk it back just a little bit, we have to start by spending more money in education in low income and working class areas and spending less money building prisons. But going forward, we have literally put every bit of society's social problems that they don't choose to handle inside prison, and we need to remove that. And second, does prison reform? I think the question is, does prison help any of these people prepare or change before they come out of prison? And it does not. I will let.
Thank you. And there's a lot to pick up on that, but Chris, can I come to you? And is there a big place where you think this discussion is kind of centered?
Absolutely. I believe that the slavery never really ended in this country, and it only metamorphosized itself into what we see today, the prison industrial complex. And if we look back at history, when we think about slavery, when we think about the convict lease system, when we think about Jim Crow laws, it just changes in a way that it just oppresses people. And so it doesn't reform. And I spent almost half my life in prison, and I can speak more about this later, but our system is set up to punish, and that isn't the right way to rehabilitate our population. It's just to punish. It's never been proven to work in any society. There's no science that backs up punishing people. Punishment actually changes a person for the better.
Kevin, I want to come to you, and I'm wondering, given your perspective and the work you're doing at FAMM, what do you see as a central issue in kind of analyzing this question?
Well, first, thanks for having me, and thanks to the Rappaport Foundation. The questions are, does prison reform? No. Do prisons need reforming? Yes. And if prisons were reformed, they might be better at reforming. And for me, just as Louise Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant, electric light, the best policeman. And the idea is that through transparency, sunlight, accountability, we can have better systems. People who are watched behave better. There's even been, social science experiments where in order to get people to pick up their trays in a cafeteria, they painted eyes on the wall, because this is the elf on the shelf, right? This is everything we know, is that people held accountable act in different ways. And though sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that is true, America's prisons and jails are the darkest places on earth. There is no accountability. There is no transparency. There's no oversight. And so what happens is, to give one of 1,000 examples you can give, there's about to be a trial out in Dublin, California, because 5 correctional officers, including the warden and a chaplain, had what was called an open rape club, where they were sexually abusing women in that federal facility, and everyone knew about it. But nobody said anything about it because there was no one to tell. Corrections officers are quiet because they worried about retaliation. People who are incarcerated are worried about retaliation. Finally, some brave women came forward, and this is going to happen. This happens everywhere, all the time. You can pick a facility and you're going to find abuse and violence and mistreatment. And it's because we don't know what's happening in these prisons. We put them far away from population centers. We don't allow the press in. We don't allow independent inspectors in. And so we have a bad system. And to me, the first step to fixing that, and an integral step, is having independent oversight.
If I
Please,
could,
Evie, jump right in, because I was just going to say that I'm listening to this and I'm thinking about what you're saying about warehousing people who have all kinds of problems that are not necessarily related to the criminal legal system. And I'm like, oh my, well, this is exactly what would happen if you did that.
So before I make my comment, I want to thank Sean Harrigan and Phyllis Rappaport and the Rappaport Foundation for allowing me to be on this panel. But I love what you said, Kevin. And I just want to add that I work on, one of the issues I work on is eliminating sexual violence in confinement, because there's no Me Too movement. But what bothers me is, in this instance, there is a law that was passed by Congress in 2003, 19 years ago, that says that it is a crime for an officer. Among other things, it says blatantly, it is a crime to sexually harass, assault, or abuse anybody who's incarcerated. So we know for the last 19 years that millions, if not $1 billion, has been spent on training officers. The officers have to pass the Prison Rape Elimination Act training tests every year. They have to do 40 hours, and none of this helps. None of what has been done for 19 years has deterred any kind of sexual violence, largely because in America, the 5,000 prisons, jails, and detention centers are little fiefdoms that are controlled by the people who run them. And neither Congress nor anybody in the bureaucracy has any control over these little fiefdoms. And I was asked recently to be in a meeting with the assistant attorney general, and she said, do you think you can change it? I said, not really. And she said, what about if we bring young officers in? I said, they won't. It'll take a couple of months before they will have to bend to the will of a structure that's been in place for 30 years.
Well, I hear those comments, and Chris, one of the things I'm thinking now is about your comments about punishment, and this thought that if we make it really, really hard, that's going to somehow reform people, and the evidence seems to be the opposite. You're muted, Chris. Unmute yourself.
I agree with you 100%. I think about, you mentioned I spent 117 days in solitary confinement. The reason why I was in solitary confinement was because someone in my housing unit had stabbed another person, and they put me in solitary confinement. The whole housing unit went on solitary confinement. And so it makes no sense, drain the swamp and punish everyone, group punishment, and all of these things. As taxpaying citizens, I have to think about, we are paying for the incarceration, and we want the public to be protected, and these practices does not protect us. And I really, I've been spending a lot of time advocating about these issues because we all want to feel safe when we come home every day, and the treatment of prisoners in America does not protect the public.
And when you say that, can you just go a little bit further with that? Because what do you mean by that?
So if you take a person who has been most likely dealt a bad hand in life, maybe grew up from foster home to foster home. Oh, big surprise. They didn't go to a good school, didn't get a good education, living in a very dangerous neighborhood, experienced significant trauma in their lives and witnessed a lot of stuff. Oh, and they end up in prison. And, America is quick to deem a person like this a monster. And I often think about, how many times has our system, as our society, failed this young person, usually before they ended up in prison. And so once this person is in prison, this person should, if we call it corrections, we should correct any social deficiencies that this person may have been that's facing. And so therapy, education, let's provide these opportunities for them. That's not really what happens. So what happens is group punishment. It's 23 hours a day sometimes in your cell. Maybe you get a shower every other day. We charge you for $10 for a 30-minute phone call, but you only make $25 a month in prison. All these things that are put in place to punish you does not make you a better person, does not protect the public. So imagine 10 years of experience this type of abuse. You come home and you're worse than you were before you went in. And oh, big surprise, you reoffend and you go back to prison. But that's what the system is designed to do. It's designed for you to fail and go back to prison.
There are two things that you touched on there that I want to follow up on. And one is slavery, because I think we are aware that, I may have the numbers wrong, it was either 3 of 4 states or 4 of 5 states. 3 of 4?
No,
4 or 5. Okay, that actually had on their ballot, we are going to remove slavery as a feature of incarceration in our state. And 4 of 5 states said, yes, we're going to do that. The state that said no is Louisiana. And so that's an interesting thing I want to follow up and get y'all's reaction on. But Kevin, I wanted to come to you because Chris just described this kind of culture of punishment. And the title of your organization, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, there is another, there is a quote from a person that says, it is not the intensity of the punishment, it's the duration that can break someone's will. And can you talk a little bit about how mandatory minimum sentences play a role in what we're talking about? Because I think what we're talking about is, if somebody goes to prison and then they come home, are they going to be a good member of our community? Have we set up a system to make them a safe part of our community, or have we set up something different?
Sure. And I think these things are connected, both sentencing and prison reform. 95% of the people who go to prison are going to come home someday. That means they're coming back to our community, and it's in everyone's interest that they come back better, not worse. And part of that, I wish people believed, meant that while they were there, as Chris said, that they got educational opportunities, mental health treatment, anger management, cognitive behavioral therapy, everything. You have a captive audience. This is your time for improvement. And a well-functioning system would use that time to help people get back on their feet. Not everybody needs to get back on their feet. Some people are fine already, but some people could use that time to improve themselves, grow up, in the rest. And we don't do that. The other thing, though, is it doesn't matter how many programs or things you have. If you keep somebody in prison for years longer than they need to be, you've already crippled them when it comes to reentry. Because, I served time with guys who, would watch the commercials and they'd say, oh, I can't wait till I get out. I'm gonna do this and this. And they're saying, by the way, what's an app? They were in prison long enough. They didn't know what an app was on a phone, right?
Yeah.
And they'd become institutionalized in a way that they knew how to live in prison. They didn't know how to live outside, which is why people get scared when it comes to leaving. And, we have to care about this. But one last point, to the cruelty point. We live in a country where it's still a sitcom punchline to say, don't drop the soap in the shower.
Yes.
We think that's funny.
Yes.
And whenever I speak to somebody, I think no matter what what crime they committed, why would that be funny that somebody would be sexually abused in prison? And why would we even think that was a joke? And I'm not a prude about jokes. I love the darkest humor you can have. Okay. But the idea is that in our culture, no one blinks an eye that is something that's supposed to be funny. And then we wonder why we subject people to that treatment. And then we think they're going to come out better. And the problem is that in our culture, we think that once you break the law, anything that happens to you downstream, anything that happens in prison, you're ultimately responsible for. And even when I talk about the women at Dublin, there are people who will say they shouldn't have been there. That's what happens when you break the law. And that's on us. That's on us to change our thinking.
Evie, you've been, I can tell, like, what are you thinking about this conversation?
It's terrific, and I'm writing notes like crazy, but I want to say this out loud before I forget it. You can't just work on changing the system. We have to change the narrative that the public understands, to Kevin's point, because if the first question I get every time I speak is, what was your crime? Then they haven't heard most of what I've said.
Right.
And what I do when people say that is I say to them, that's a question that you shouldn't really ask us, because then you will view me, as the great Brian Stevenson says, as that person who did that thing at that moment, and I will not be forgiven. You will always see me as an offender in that way, and I am not my worst mistake. And quite frankly, if I went through your life, you're probably not your worst mistake either. What I want to say is, when we ask the question, is it a punitive system? Punitive is this big word that I think we need to break down. Because just to say it's not, when people say it's a system of punishment, we want a system of rehab. No, most of the audience doesn't really know what we mean. So by punishment, I mean, when I was in solitary, and when they allowed us to even have that 1 hour, because if it was, they would do anything to avoid having to because you have to go down one person at a time. And that means they actually have to do some work, which really—
Somebody has to work, right?
Somebody has to work. So I'm 71 years old, and I was in prison. I was in solitary when I was about 63. And so they would shackle you and then bring you down a flight of stairs. But I had balance problems, and I needed to hold on to the banister to walk down the stairs. And the guard says, I'm giving you a choice. Don't hold the banister or go back inside. And I said, but I can't walk down the stairs. My ankles are chained and I will trip and fall and die. And he said, well, it's your choice. So I think what we should call it is what it is. They are sadistic. It is sadistic. It is cruel. And it brings out the worst in everybody who works there, as far as I'm concerned. And one more thought that I'll throw in for everybody to respond. In Rikers Island, we're currently spending $500,000 a person to keep them incarcerated. These are new numbers. This is insanity. This is not about punishment or rehab. You can get somebody into an apartment and have a full-time 24-hour caregiver for 1/4 of, a tenth of the money, and make them well. What are we doing?
Kevin, you had a reaction real quick.
Yeah, I just want to say something because I don't think Evie and I disagree on this point, but she said this is sadistic. And the only thing I would distinguish is I think there's good and bad systems. I think there's good bankers and bad bankers, good bakers, bad bakers, good teachers, bad teachers. The line of good and evil goes through every human heart. I don't think corrections officials are sadistic. I think they are also trapped in a bad system where otherwise good people end up doing bad things, and that they also would benefit from oversight because they can't complain or tell anybody when something's going on because they fear reprisals. And so the problem is that a system that has no accountability and transparency breeds this kind of corruption and sadistic behavior. But I think again, I don't think men are angels. I don't think we're waiting for good people to run these systems. I think we need average people to run these systems in a way that incentivizes good behavior.
Well, and the thing that I'll say about that, just to kind of add to the thought, is think back to what were called the Stanford prison experiments, where they took people and said, you're a prisoner and you're a guard. And they then had them interacting and they were filming the interactions. They had to stop those experiments because the people who were guards were starting to raise the level of brutality so much that they thought this is getting out of hand. And so part of what you're saying about, it's not about individuals. There is a system that is set up to categorize you as less than human and the guard of less than human. And that system will push you to the point where you look in the mirror one day and say, what the hell did I just do? Or what the hell did I just think was normal? And oh my God, and you have that realization. Chris, I just want to jump to you because it looks like you've got some thought there.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, and it's I'm gonna just be brutally honest. I just feel, just being a Black man in America, oftentimes correctional officers, and I agree with the point that was made that not all prison guards and officials are bad. There were a handful, more than a handful of prison guards and especially the teachers in the schools inside of the prisons who didn't agree with the policies of the institution, allowed me to stay through midterms to take my exams while in college. And so I definitely think that's really important to mention. But when I think about just being a Black man in America, oftentimes, even some of my counselors, I write about this in my book, they would tell me, you don't deserve to go to school. You will be lucky if you get a job at a gas station when you get out. And it's my job to punish you. You shouldn't have any of this stuff. The stuff that you have now, which isn't much, you don't deserve it. And I had to spend 16 and a half years under this type of treatment, and they were being paid to rehabilitate and provide correctional services for us, and it just does not happen. And so I think about all of this stuff. I don't want us to think that all prison officials are bad, because they are not. I work with a lot of prison officials. I work with judges now and state's attorneys. I do agree 100% with Kevin. There should be oversight. And there should be metrics, not just oversight, but metrics of if people in school, how many people do you plan to graduate to get their high school diplomas?
Mm-hmm.
How many people should graduate from vocational trades? Because this is what will protect the public by providing these opportunities for people.
One of the things that I remember from, we had just a little pre-event conversation, and as I have heard so much of each of you talk about how a system can transform a person to normalize brutality. I've also heard a conversation about a person in prison, an incarcerated person, has to be ready to take on the things that are going to improve their life. And the treatment inside the prison oftentimes will have something to do with whether a person is ready to accept some of the programs that are there. Evie, could you start us off talking about that maybe?
Well, in the I was in federal women's prisons, and they had, their biggest program was GED. And they got paid $2,500 for every GED that they were able to get. And they tried to force me and lots of people who had law degrees, medical degrees.
Wow.
No, they threatened us unless we took the GED course, and we got punished for not taking the GED course. We were not allowed to go to the educational building for months because we wouldn't take the GED. So my experience is probably a little different from Kevin and Chris, in that I did not experience very many correctional officers that I found to be empathetic or sympathetic. I want to, if I could just add a piece.
Mm-hmm.
When I walked into prison on day one, veterans walk over to you and they say, you need to be, if you want to do easy time, you need to be under the radar. You need for nobody to know your name, the warden to not know you, and that's the best. Otherwise, you're going to do hard time. And people were introducing themselves and asking me, are you married? Do you have a kid? No. Are you married? Do you have a kid? And finally, I made a big mistake by saying, I'm not married. I don't have a kid. I'm a lesbian. And what happened to me was I was punished for coming out in two ways. One, they had me sleep in an area where the lights were on 24 hours and in front of a machine that was crushing ice every 20 minutes. And for work, I was over 60, and most people over 60 are permitted to do a job where they mop a floor and then can read a book. They put me in 90-degree heat in landscaping and gave me a broom and told me to sweep the rocks off the streets. So I experienced my entire time there, I experienced being punished, and I was told it was because I came out. And they don't want anybody to come out.
I think the thing for me is I hear that, and I don't hear that as disagreeing or contradicting anything Kevin and Chris have said about there being people who work in prisons that see what it is and want there to be things that are different. It's just that this system produces the kind of behavior that you just described. And what I don't see Chris and Kevin doing is going, oh, well, that's really extreme. I've never heard of anything like that happening. I couldn't imagine, people going that far. And I think that's one of the things that I hope our listeners will internalize, is that these vignettes are so important and so powerful because they're not unique. There is no uniqueness about them whatsoever.
And
it is a
just say to that,
characterization.
Jeffrey, if I can just say to that.
Please.
Well, just because I'm a white man and I had a lot of advantages when I went to prison, but to Chris's point, I don't know many white people, unless they're completely self-unaware or unself-aware, who didn't realize the disparate treatment from most guards to people who are white or black. Now, it's a weird thing, right? I just visited a state prison in Pennsylvania. Half the correctional officers were black women, right? So I don't know how that plays out everywhere, but in a lot of places in America, these prisons are in rural, remote places.
Right.
I saw a lot of Trump voters and devotees before the election during my time in prison, and I had been in this bubble of being around Washington, D.C., but I saw the treatment. I benefited from it. And but it was partly because where we locate these prisons.
Right.
It's just a matter of fact. I mean, it's the best job in a rural place, but the talent you're going to attract, you're not going to find the best psychologist to work your RDAP programs or your anger management programs, because they don't want to live in, Bum Hills, USA. And so that's another problem we have. But exactly what you're saying, all the things, everybody who's been formerly incarcerated can sit in a room and just nod. You can talk about the medical treatment. You can talk about guys who have, don't get cavities filled, so they lose 8 teeth, and they're there, it's just the sheer inhumanity of it that goes on. And it's because, but I always say this, I never want to scapegoat it. It's because our fellow citizens don't care enough to demand better. And that really, like, we let ourselves off the hook if we think there's a boogeyman. The politicians in a democracy would listen if voters demanded that people in prison be treated with dignity, but too often they're okay with what happens inside, is my fear.
Well, and that is, I mean, it raises, I think, a very important point, because one of the things that's always resonating in my mind is the title of the book written by William Burroughs, Naked Lunch. And when he was asked, what does that title mean? He said, it's that moment when everyone has to look at what's really on the end of everyone else's fork. And if we had that naked lunch moment with prisons in America, especially realizing that 95% of the people going to prison are coming back home, I wonder what answer would we give ourselves if we said, I would like, in fill in the blank, 2 years, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, when this person comes back to the community, I would like them not to be a threat to the community. I'd like them to have the capability of being a contributing member. What would prisons look like? If we asked ourselves that question. Go ahead, Evie.
So unfortunately, when I'm speaking to audiences and I'll ask them for a show of hands as to how many people believe in the death penalty, and then I'll be in an all-white audience and nobody will raise their hand because they'll say they don't believe in the death penalty. But then if I follow it up by walking over to someone sitting in the first row and said, I just murdered your husband, what do you want to have happen to me? And I said, be honest. And she said, I want you dead. So we have a big problem with the public in not only changing the narrative that we don't come home and sit around and think, what bank am I going to rob tomorrow? I know no one who does that.
Right.
We come home and we want to get a jump start on our lives, and we want to begin again and leave that experience for the most part. I mean, not everybody, but most people. The problem is that we have to deal with and I don't think changing policy is going to change minds. So, and I'm for people working on policy reform, but I think the larger thing that we can do is change the narrative. And I think even the words change the narrative has to be more specific. We have to make people understand we're human beings. We have to make people understand who we are, and they need to meet us upfront and personal. We can't just be this population called criminals. And I think that until we're in proximity with people, until we're interacting and set up situations, I'm in a fellowship with half law students and half formerly incarcerated people. And they will tell us out loud that they love us, and they're shocked.
Yes.
I'm not shocked by that. But
Let me just share this for 1 minute, because you mentioned, understanding what quote unquote victims want. And part of what I think is important about that, actually, give me a second. Part of what I think is important about that is, as a criminal defense lawyer, I can remember many times when I would try and talk to family members of victims, people who had been killed in homicides or other kinds of victims of violent crime, and talk to family members about, what is it that you really want? What is it that would address the issues that you feel, need to be addressed? And so many times, prosecutors were not interested in that happening. So let me see if I can just show you this really quickly. It's not going to let me do it. I'll just read this so folks can get an understanding of what I'm referring to. When victims of violent crime are asked, what is it that you really want? Almost at incredibly high levels, they're talking about restitution. They're talking about understanding why the event happened. They're talking about what's going to happen when this person comes out. They're talking about the things that the three of you have been talking about. And the problem is that what our system offers them is, well, we're going to throw them in this box and do the things that y'all have been describing. And that is one of the places where I think the system is lying to the public, because we are lying to people by telling them that's going to have an impact on what your major concerns are, most of which are non-repetition and some sort of restoration to the extent that that's possible from the person who harmed you. Kevin, you have a pensive look on your face. What are you thinking?
No, I just, you know, when you listen to somebody, but you keep the same thought in your head for a while, I haven't been able to stop thinking since Evie last spoke, which is, I'm just 100% on proximity, that you have to go into the prisons. FAMM right now is running a hashtag visit a prison campaign designed to get policymakers, judges, prosecutors into prisons. Most of these people set policy, they set our sentencing laws, they sentence people to prison, they prosecute. They've never stepped foot in a prison. And what people don't realize is how long a year is, or 2 years. We have had such sentence inflation in this country that you're like, oh, we only got 5 years? 5 years in prison is a long time. I was only gone 20 months and I looked at the clock every day. And to her point about getting to know people, I do worry that you meet somebody like Chris Wilson and you think he's a unicorn because he does so well.
Right.
And he'll be the first one to tell you, there's a lot of guys I left behind who are ready to have a second chance too. And so we, you know, in the criminal justice movement, unlike in the gay rights movement with like Will and Grace, where we said, these are the people among you. These are your neighbors and friends and family members. In criminal justice, we still unicorn people. And it's like, look at this amazing success story. They're the rare person, or see prison works. And that's not true, but people don't know enough of people, and they don't know people who've been away. And that proximity can only be cured by going into prisons and seeing who we're talking about.
I've always said, and this is just relative to what you just said about people who will point to any successful Black folks in American society and say, see, they made it. Anybody can. And what that's really an example of is, despite every effort that your system has made, there are some people who have slipped through the cracks and have gained some modicum of success. But I think, and Chris, I know you won't be insulted by this. I'm constantly saying, you know, I've worked as hard as anybody to get where I've gotten, but I'm lucky.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you, no matter how hard you worked and how brilliant you are, you were lucky to get to where you are.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, totally.
I have a question that has come from some folks in the audience. I wanted to throw it out to see what y'all are thinking of, or what would think of it. They've talked about how, and I think several people have brought this up, many times prisons are in rural locations and it's a real financial boon to the people in those locations. So when you start talking about closing prisons or incarcerating fewer people, you're talking about jobs. How do we address that narrative?
I don't think it's as complicated as we make it. Just in Alderson, West Virginia, which has a prison which I was at, the town basically had 3 jobs. So the same is true for the women's prison in Aliceville, Alabama. The town had 3 jobs until the prison came. I think you just need to transition them out of prison jobs and into other jobs. It used to be create a technology hub. We have a medical marijuana industry. There are plenty of things that we have climate change industry. There's no shortage of ways of converting we're not talking about 1 million jobs here. You put the right form of clean energy into that town, you will have more jobs than you do at prison, and it'll be a better quality job.
Kevin or Chris? You're muted, Kevin.
I agree with her. I do think we overthink this. These are government jobs. This is not like a private plant moving away and now government has to take all these people on the roll and figure it out. The money the government is saving from having, to pay for another prison, the state, if it's some rural part of the state's going to have to invest money in that area to, bring jobs or do job training or do whatever. I mean, that's no reason to keep people in cages. So like there's a higher priority here that we have to keep in mind. And I do think it's a really weak argument.
Well,
I agree with everyone, what everyone said. And I will state that I'm an optimistic person, but I think that America, most of America wants prisons. We want to punish people, and to the point earlier of about, that's what you get when you break the law. I heard this, I heard it the whole time I was incarcerated, and it's like, but like, this isn't right. And it's like, you shouldn't have broke the law and you deserve it. And it's just something that's strange when we think about the Stanford prison studies and everything that happened in the 50s or whatever. It's something about us. I don't know what it is, how to articulate it correctly, but we just like doing this to people. This is the quote your project, but like, this is who we are actually.
It's not only people who are outside of prison.
Yeah.
You walk into the TV room, they're watching Lockup. And they're watching the Casey Anthony trial and screaming, put her in prison. And I'm saying, are you crazy?
Yes.
We're in prison and you're watching Lockup. And this is the choice you make. So we have to change more than just the people outside.
This is a question. This is a statement about United States culture and the culture of punishment and how we view punishment in this country. And I know we were talking before about, I always refer people to think about this man, Anton Breivik, who in Norway killed 77 people, including teenagers. And the Norway media described it as the worst act of terror in that country since World War II. And when they came to his sentencing, people were outraged, and the judges gave him the maximum sentence, 21 years. Now in America, he would have had either a needle in his arm or a sentence of, 800 years or, 77 consecutive life with no parole sentences. So what is it about Norway? Because they care about their people, their social programs are a lot better than ours, their crime rate is a lot lower than ours. What is it about Norway that makes them see that situation and be horrified and think 21 years? As opposed to the way we think about it. And there are some people in Norway who will say, we have never othered people in our culture the way you have in America. And in order to treat people the way you do in your prisons, you have to first other them. And then it's like, Chris, you were saying, if it turns out that you're a white guy that goes to prison, it's like, Kevin, you may have some advantages, but hey, you committed a crime, so you're just in it now, and you got to deal with it the way everybody else has to deal with it. And I think that part of our culture is something it's ugly and difficult to come to grips with, but something that needs the light of day, as I think Kevin would say, to ask ourselves, why are we doing this?
Norway has the advantage, though, of being a homogeneous population.
Yes, and that's what they're saying. We haven't othered anybody the way you have, because we don't have anybody to other.
But we other, even if not for prison. We have a hierarchical system, we have a structure. But I just want to throw this out. I do think that having been a lesbian who came out in the 1970s and lived through 40 years of very difficult times until we got rights, if there are 80 million people who've been convicted of a crime and we all came out as criminals, I think it would help. But people are ashamed about having been involved with the justice system, so they don't say it. So when I'm giving a talk and a kid walks over to me afterwards and hugs me and says, my dad's in prison, nobody knows. And that the problem is it's a secret. It's an 80 million person secret. And there's even more people, as you pointed out, 113 million with families. So that's 1/3 of this nation. Think about how we could change if people weren't ashamed.
So we've gotten a couple of questions about, okay, so what are some things that could change? And I've heard about programs that focus on some of the questions are programs focusing on rapid job reentry or job placement. What are some effective things that, as we have talked about what prisons are like, how can we make it more effective so that people coming out of prisons have a better shot of coming back into our communities in a successful way? Kevin, can I start with you? What is the thing that you would emphasize?
I do have an answer. Well, I think Chris is going to be better on this than I am. But I just want to say one thing that I have seen work, because I don't believe programming in and of itself does it. I think you have to be ready for it. That's sort of my view, is that people grow up, they decide, I want to make a change. And once they make a change, they take advantage of what exists. But one thing I have seen work is reaching out to people while they're still in. Starting that really planning, like if we had you had a social worker that was working with you, like I'm 3 years from the door, I'm 2 years from the door. I need to figure out what I want to do when I get out there. How am I going to achieve it? What do I need to get to that? Where do I want to live? It may be a good job, but it's in a neighborhood you're not dying to go back to because you left people there who's the wrong crowd for you. I knew guys inside who were like, I'm going to have all the same temptations back when I go there. That's very real. But trying to get a prison to release you somewhere else and work with you on that process is very difficult. So my thing is start that process much earlier. It's not just I came out and I got a job. It's a lot more than that. And that would take some planning and some real investment, but I think it would pay off.
Chris?
I agree. Yeah, I agree with Kevin 100%. I think reentry should start the moment that you unfortunately go to prison. So as soon as you go in, you should be thinking about how did I end up here? I actually partnered with an ed tech company about a year ago. It's called APDS. And I turned my book into a software course, which it was a 13-week course that helps people walk through the process of turning the lives around, understanding trauma, understanding rock bottom moments for themselves, helping them develop self-agency over themselves and thinking about who is it, what do I want to do when I get, how did I end up in here? These are things that I did the old fashioned way. It's like, how did I end up in prison? I'm a good person. And most people, I'll tell you this, most people who are out committing crimes and also are in prison, they don't want to live this life. It's not sexy. It's not fun. You're paying lawyers, you're in and out of jail. They don't want to do it. But the path towards earning a livable wage or getting in school or being able to get a job is so difficult in America that people just go to like the easiest route. And I think that our prison systems, we should think about things that we know that actually work, that science backs up of. If we provide this education, I had tremendous amounts of trauma. I watched my mom be raped in front of me at the age of 15. I watched 5 of my friends be killed in front of me before the age of 17. All of these things that happen. And then, you throw me into a prison environment with grown men. I was 17 years old, 118 pounds. And the only way I was able to rehabilitate myself was through therapy and through school and through mentorship. And I think our public overall, we all need to understand that a lot of people in this country are dealt a bad hand. It should not be a surprise that they end up in prison. And we got to think about, if we're paying for it already, how do we want our prisons to run? And I think that's what I want to advocate. It's like, I think about, I don't believe that I can change this prison system in my lifetime. But what I aspire to do is to try to educate and inspire enough people who've been impacted by it, their families and individuals in prison, to not go back, to understand this system is set up for you to fail.
Right.
So if I can provide people with skills where they can navigate and dodge this system that's out to get them, then my work is done.
Evie, what do you think here?
So I'm going to go right off of Chris's last comment and say, rather than repeat what they're both saying, when you look at reentry, I spent 16 months homeless. I was resourceful enough, having worked 30 years, I was resourceful enough to know to go to every single reentry type facility that I could go to. What I will tell you is this: you cannot restart a life. We have to completely change what's going on in reentry, because for 30 years, we've given hundreds, in New York alone, $100 million to organizations. You give me a meal, a Metro card, a resume, and then say goodbye. The truth is that that is a system that will guarantee us being marginalized, isolated, or going back to prison. And in the 30 years that we've given probably $1 billion to reentry, there has been no reduction of recidivism, and there's been no increase in long-term employment or long-term housing. So that system, it's not broken. It's working the way they want it to work. And formerly incarcerated people are trying to wrestle that reentry system away from the people running it, because they don't, we know what we need. And what we need, Kevin said, is and Chris said, is that you start this process right at the beginning, that you know who's in prison, you know, you get the DNA of each person and you figure out a plan for each person, not some monolithic program like GED, but what plan suits. I want to be a dog groomer. Okay. We don't need to put you through a GED for you to be a dog groomer. You know, you want to be a doctor? Okay, then this is the plan for you. We need to help each person so that they have a chance to do something with their lives that they probably wanted to do all along.
I've heard a couple of questions, or seen a couple of questions about, are there ways to efficiently combine state and federal resources? Because I think the kind of direction of the questions is, are the state and federal resources aligned, or are they kind of, you know, one hand is doing one thing and the other hand is not coordinated at all? Kevin, do you have a perspective on that?
I'm not smart enough on that one. I really don't know the answer to that.
Chris, Evie?
Well,
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Chris.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, Evie.
Well, the federal system has as far as I'm concerned, the federal system funds and is in charge of the Bureau of Prisons, which is in charge of 200,000 people. States are in charge of more than 2 million. And I don't think those pots of money cross. And the rules are very, very different. So the rules for the departments of corrections in cities and states run, again, these are fiefdoms too.
Right.
They have their own budget. They get it from their own city, or they get it from their own state, and the feds get their budget from the federal budget. So I don't think they cross. And it would be a scary thing to think, if the feds were in charge of everything, then we basically wouldn't get any information about what's going on in prison from anywhere.
I'm just looking at some of the questions that people have thrown out. One of the things that I'd like to address, and this is another thing where the narrative can be very both poisonous and powerful. People have said, you know, there is a strong narrative about violent crime and people who are dangerous. And just in discussing this issue, I've heard a couple of you talk about dangerousness and being traumatized, and the appropriate definition perhaps, and also how those two things have relation to each other. Thoughts on that?
I'd like to jump in and speak on this. Unfortunately, I grew up around a lot of people in prison and in my community that were severely traumatized, that some people would refer to them as being dangerous. I also had an opportunity to go to therapy with these individuals over a period of 14, 15 years. And one of the things that I learned a few years in is that hurt people hurt people. And a lot of people that I spent time with in therapy have been sexually assaulted, have been abused. And we fail these victims in this country. We don't, there aren't, at least in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, when someone lost a friend, I lost a lot of friends. When I would go to school, they would say, get over it. You live in the hood. And people get shot, do your math problems. And I couldn't process the trauma that I experienced. A lot of people go through a lot of stuff in America, and we just expect people to get over it. And I think about, bullies and people who abuse students like constantly. And then one day, like a student snaps, we have to be more preventative as a country to how we address issues that we face. And so I just think about that. I had my car broken into a few months ago, and I was upset. I was pissed. I just brought the car, and someone stole my speakers out my car. And I felt like that person should be punished for it. But I also thought about, what is this person out like 3 o'clock in the morning breaking in cars for? What happened in your life that there isn't a path for you like to do something more productive? I was thinking about all of these things, but I don't think most people think about that.
I wanted to say on the trauma thing, I'm sort of an old curmudgeon and I'm more conservative, and I think we overuse the word trauma. But if trauma means anything, it means growing up in a neighborhood where you're hearing gunshots at night. We talked about people coming back from war and how the PTSD and that trauma, and we have GI Bill of Rights and things, because we say when this person comes home, we're really going to have to help them stand back up and reintegrate. And, I'm just grateful and lucky that I didn't live in a neighborhood like that. And so even I had to learn, I didn't have friends whose parents were selling drugs and even doing any of that. And so as I got older, I thought, well, I'm a lemming. I just did what my friends did. If my friends were doing that, I don't know that I would have said, hey, this is the wrong thing to do. The same is true even for violence. I don't grow up in a neighborhood where I'm worried that me or my friends are going to get shot on a given day, or that, or involved in some dangerous activity. And so I just think there shouldn't be this binary between violence and nonviolence. I think somebody who sells fentanyl to a kid is probably more dangerous than somebody who gets in a bar fight, but one's violent and one's not. And so I think to just say, if you commit an act of violence, you're another. We've got a person on our staff who committed murder at 19. He's not that person anymore. But again, you got to know them, and you got to realize that people can grow up, and acts of violence can be, just completely impulsive, which really means it's not who that person is. Whereas a sustained life of committing crime may indicate something different. Violence should not be the binary that it is today.
You take a state like Texas, where if there are 5 kids in a room and one of them shoots someone and kills someone, all 5 are getting felony murder charges because they happen to be in that room. If there's 17 people in that room, 17 people are going to prison for life because of what one person did. So there is a mislabeling, or rather, there are so many people in prison who were literally at the wrong place at the wrong time at a party that should never have been, that are labeled violent, that are labeled dangerous, that were, and when described, they were part of a group, as if this group had a conversation, let's murder this person. They never had that conversation. So I know people who went into prison because they were running away as teenagers from home, from bad situations. and one of them made the mistake of shooting someone. And then these kids who are 16 who are trying to get away from domestic violence or incest are all of a sudden now locked up till they're 67. So we really have to understand who's in prison for what.
I have had an interesting question that pops up about the potential role of restorative justice. I'd like to get your thoughts on that issue, because I think that there are many people who are afraid of it and opposed to it. I'm not quite sure why, but thoughts on that?
I'll start if somebody else wants to. Okay, I'm one of those who has mixed feelings, and I'm still trying to learn more about it. I will say that restorative justice should not be an alternative to the justice system we have. It should be part of it. One thing that I sort of saw in prison was, guys who had made mistakes. They committed crimes. They broke the law. They weren't claiming innocence, but being in prison almost absolved them of any responsibility. They didn't have to think about it. They didn't have to think about the victims of a drug trade they might have contributed to, or violence that might have arose out of that. So in some way, prison protects you from responsibility. It warehouses you. It's awful, but you don't have to do the sort of the moral, hard work of grappling with why you did it. Like Chris said, like, how did I get here? Why did I do that? If you want to avoid that, you can go work out, go hang out with your buddies. Like, you can avoid that introspection if you want to. So I think that should be part of it no matter what. My only concern about restorative justice, as sort of the way I hear it now, is I also believe in equal protection. And I don't think you want some people saying, oh, I've got a victim who's willing to go this path. This other victim isn't. They want vengeance. And so this person gets 10 years for something, whereas this other person gets to work through their stuff. So like, there's holes in it for me as a universal solution. But the idea of restoration has to be built into our system anyway. If you look at, we were working on clemency in New York, and the governor's office, there would be some people, these people committed violent crimes. When the governor's office reached out to them because they thought these people were rehabilitated, they reached out to the victims' families. The families were completely traumatized. They were like, no, I don't want that person out. This is the first time they've heard from anybody from the state in 20 or 30 years.
Right.
So that work hadn't been done. That pain and suffering and trauma hadn't been addressed. So of course you get this outcome. And so I just think it's not a restorative justice versus our current system. I think it needs to be integrated into our current system.
Yeah, I agree with Kevin, and I actually integrated restorative justice into the software course that we've developed, the master plan course. I actually, 6 years into my incarceration, I learned about this process where I participated in a group of victims of crimes who came into the prison, and we sat down and we had therapy together for 6 months. And I gotta say, honestly, it was the moment after doing these groups of when I truly felt what remorse was. And it was a lady, I write about this in my book, and she talked about, her car was stolen and she had to get a new car. And then she talked about when her daughter was attacked and murdered. And I just remember how I felt when she explained everything that happened. I never really thought about how things were from the victim's standpoint. And it just changed me forever. And so I think that the restorative justice approach is definitely important. It's an integral a part of rehabilitation for folks. You need to see the other side. I get that, and I mentor hundreds of people over the past 10 years. I get that people that have been through stuff and hurt people, but you also need to understand the other side of it. And so I think that's important too. So I agree with you, Kevin. It should be integrated. It should be a part of the process. You did wrong. You should be punished, but here's how you get better. Here's how you reacclimate into society. I think I just don't deserve that. Yeah.
Evie, go ahead, and then I'll share something, but go ahead.
No, I'm done. I think we deserve it as a country. We need it.
I don't think restorative justice is a therapy session. I think it's a process that could be incredibly useful as long as you're committed to engaging in community. There is, I think we have to make people responsible to each other. And it's not just it's not just the person who commits the crime in the family, it's the rabbi, it's the priest, it's the neighborhood person. I think that I know because I go to synagogue every Saturday, that to some extent, even though there's no crime or restorative justice involved, because I go, you become connected to the community that you go to, and if somebody needs something, you want to help them. So for me, restorative justice is about the community having a response and helping both parties, the party that's been, both parties, to, it's not about seeing the light, it's working it out. It's working it out. It's much deeper than that, it's much longer than that, and it's a process.
I just want to share that I found it very interesting. Much of my career was spent as a criminal defense lawyer, and in one situation, I was retained by a woman whose husband had been killed in a random shooting. They were literally driving to the airport, and some kids were beefing with each other, and somebody fired a gun into the air, and one of the shots hit her husband in the head. And she wanted to meet the young man that did it, to ask him, what were you thinking? What were you doing? I want to know why this happened. And so I talked to the defense lawyer, who said, absolutely. The prosecutors were dead set against it. And I believe they were dead set against it because they were operating under the system that Kevin described, which is, oh, if we do this, we're taking it out of the punitive system, or out of this system where punishment is an aspect. So we can't allow that to happen. They couldn't see it as a part of the same system. And it finally happened. And it was interesting because the prosecutors showed up to the event in blue jeans and an untucked shirt and a baseball hat. And I think it was done. And everyone else was dressed very formally. The young man who was incarcerated was in his orange jumpsuit, but it was clear he had taken a shower. Someone had combed his hair and cut his hair. Everyone was taking this as like a solemn event, but the prosecutor was threatened that the narrative that rules the criminal justice system was going to be shaken. So he had to show up in a way that showed disrespect for the event. And I think it's that, and Kevin, you may have put your finger on it, the fact that many people want to say that it's either or, and like most things in life, it's not. It's both and no one is saying that punishment isn't some legitimate part of the criminal legal system, but punishment is different than torture, and what kind of punishment and how much punishment is a different question. I wanted to go to one other issue. We've talked a little bit about education. We've talked a little bit about independent oversight. If we talk money, considering the amount of money that is spent on our prison systems, is there a better way to spend that money? Because we are talking billions of dollars a year, I think, when you take into account both federal and state systems, both private and state-run institutions, both prisons and jails and holding facilities. We're talking an incredible amount of money. Is there a better way to spend that money?
I think we need another 2 hours. The answer is, of course. It's a system that's not broken. It's a system that serves. It's a job system. It's a profitable system. It's, I think we'd all agree that California was building a prison a day in 1973 instead of a school or a hospital. I think we all know this. If you build educational institutions and you put money into education, put money into health, put money into housing, if people had a home and had food security and had health security, it would be far better than if they had prison security.
I agree. And just to add to that, I think we should definitely make these investments on the front end. And I don't want to say that we should invest in the current prison system, education and therapy, like I've been championing throughout this call. But we should be doing this in like elementary school and basic level. People shouldn't end up in prison. And we're smart. We know what's going on. And this is a deliberate thing that we do here in America. But that's where I think we should invest the money. And we waste so much money, especially as seniors. We spend so much money on folks, and like, who are they a threat to, really? And we just pay and just spend and spend. So, but I would say invest on the front end, invest in counselors. Let's prevent people from actually going to prison. I think that's the smartest thing that we should do.
We are about approaching the end of our time, and I wanted to come to each of you for just kind of some final thoughts. Understanding what the problem is, in my view, is a critical part of being able to design a solution. And so one of the things I've heard from all three of you is that this is not a system that is somehow broken and operating in a way not designed. This is a system that's running on all cylinders and operating exactly the way it has been designed. Are there final thoughts about this system, about the system we've allowed to exist in this country, and what Americans can do about it? Kevin, can I start with you?
Sure. Again, thanks for having me. I would say that one, if you tell a story of good versus evil, Tyler Cowen, the economist, said, automatically you lose 10 IQ points. I think too often these debates, it's we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And I just don't believe that in anything. And I think our country's getting more into those sort of morality tales. I obviously think we are on the right side of this issue, but I think it's a difficult issue. I think we talked about the instinct to punish has served humans well since they left the savannah. And it is also biological. We have a dopamine reaction when we punish people. So it's ingrained. And to be tough on crime is no less moral to me to being tough on pollution or being tough on child abuse. What's wrong with being tough on things that are bad for us? But the problem is our solutions aren't making us safer. And so we have to recognize the value that people want, safety, health, and just say the solutions, that instinct that we have is not serving us well. But recognize that that's a natural instinct, and that desire to punish is real, and that in America, this idea of individual responsibility and individual accomplishment also means when you screw up, you get punished very harshly as an individual. We don't say you're a product of bad circumstances. We say you made bad choices and you're going to pay for it. So, but it's tough. And so all I would just say is these are going to be tough solutions too. Because as I always tell people, if we're not winning, it's because we're not convincing our relatives and our friends and our parents and our neighbors that we're on the right side of this. And those of us who have been in the system and have seen it up close just have a responsibility to keep speaking out and saying, I respect your value for safety, law, and order, but this system is not producing it. And we could do better. And so you're going to have to let go of some of that punitiveness if you want a safe community. All the things we talk about, 95% are coming home. They don't come home better when you treat them like this. So right. I think, we just got to meet them though where they are and not discount them as monsters who are punitive or trying to screw people over. Every country has prisons. Every country has punishment. We're just doing things to an excess that's not helpful. But I would just say, recognize in our opponents that their instincts and their desires are similar to ours. We just think they have the wrong approach.
Kevin, thank you very much. Chris, can I come to you?
Yes, just to add, thank you, it's beautifully spoken to, Kevin. I agree with you. I think that to add to it, I really want us to think about as individuals what we all can do. We think about there was people went out to vote yesterday, other day, and there are state's attorneys, there are judges who have incredible discretionary power that if someone has a drug addiction problem, they instead of 10 years in prison, they can go into a drug treatment facility. So I encourage individuals to think about our local elected officials and what their stances are and laws that can have a tremendous amount of impact in your community. So I would encourage people to do that. I will also think about, I think, the sense of, wanting someone to be punished. And I sympathize greatly with victims of crime. Being in prison is punishment alone, but we need to think about how our prisons are actually run and does it actually make us safer? And so this is why I have invested, my life's work is in creating these courses that helps people think about the situations that they're in and how they turn their lives around and how they choose a different path in life. And so I would encourage everyone on this call to think about what are things that actually work and what is it that we can do as individuals to invest in it. And so I would just end it at that.
Evie, I'm going to ask you to bring us home.
I'm going to go a slightly different route and say that people who are incarcerated are not just criminals, they're talents. So, and as I tell some employers, some of your best logistic people are drug dealers because they know to the penny
Yes.
on every corner how much they're supposed to be due. And if you're a bank robber, this bank should be hiring you for security because if they got in, there's a lot of talent and we laugh, but so I built a project called the MAP project. And what it is I realized that after 30 years of work history, I could not get a job because between my age and my felony conviction, nobody was going to hire me. And I wasn't. And so I started Witness to Mass Incarceration. There are thousands, if not 5,000 to 10,000 of people who are coming out of prison who have amazing talent that are trying to start small businesses. And if we're going to if you want to reduce recidivism immediately, allow people not to live in a state of poverty, support them. So I looked for a place to buy eyeglasses. I wanted to buy eyeglasses from a formerly incarcerated person. And there was no way to find one. So what I did is I built a directory listing 1,100 small businesses that are led by formerly incarcerated people, businesses and services. And I believe that if we throw support, not into workforce development entirely and not into working for somebody else, but support the guy who in solitary designed 250 sets of sneakers, and his sneakers are now selling in Nordstrom's. Let's support the people who have talent, which are so many of us, and set aside some funds to bring them together or bring an awareness that if you support us, recidivism gets reduced immediately because we're out of a state of poverty. And we can pay our rent.
I just want to thank all three of you. It's a wonderful place to end. Isn't it remarkable what can happen when you give someone a path to living a life that is productive and a life that has less stress in it, and a life where you can look 5 years down the road and say, I could do that. I could achieve that. I have goals now because I can see into the future and it doesn't all look dark. Thank you all so much. Phyllis, thank you for hosting this, and to the Rappaport Center for putting this kind of programming out so that people can grapple with these issues. It is greatly appreciated.
Thank you to all of you. You were amazing, truly amazing. And people want more information, so we will provide that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.
Night.